She sat alone in her chamber, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other clutching a rosary worn smooth by endless prayer. Outside, the bells of London rang in celebration. Inside, Mary Tudor whispered to herself, "This child will save England. This child will save me." The cradle was already waiting, draped in gold and silk, as if the kingdom could will a prince into existence through splendor alone. Priests rehearsed the baptism. Courtiers rehearsed their bows. All of England was ready to kneel before a child who had not yet taken a breath. But Mary could feel the silence. No fluttering beneath her ribs, no stir of tiny limbs, only a stillness that grew heavier with each passing night. In the glow of the candle, her reflection in the mirror looked less like a mother and more like a woman haunted by promise. She prayed harder. She pressed her hands to her stomach, as if sheer faith could awaken life within her. Yet the doubt crept closer, like a shadow she could not push away. What if the whispers in the streets were true? What if she carried not a son, but a punishment? Her heart battled itself in those long hours of solitude. She was queen, but she was also a daughter who had seen her own mother cast aside. A woman desperate to give England the heir that would justify her reign and her faith. This is not just the story of a queen. It is the story of a woman who twice prepared to bring life into the world, only to be met by silence. Stay until the end, as we uncover how her womb's betrayal turned Mary into the figure remembered as Bloody Mary. Subscribe now and step deeper into the shadows of history. Mary Tudor carried her crown like a burden that never left her shoulders. She had taken the throne after years of chaos, after plots that had nearly ended her life, after whispers that she was unfit to rule. Her triumph had silenced her enemies for a moment, but she knew the battle was not over. England expected more than a queen. It expected a mother. Without a Catholic heir, her reign would be fragile. Every law she passed, every mass she restored, could be undone the moment she died. The kingdom's eyes turned toward Elizabeth, her half-sister, younger, Protestant, and dangerous to everything Mary believed was sacred. Unless Mary produced a son, Elizabeth's claim would rise like a shadow ready to swallow her achievements. Mary was almost 40 when she married Philip of Spain. To her, it was more than an alliance of crowns. It was a covenant with God. She had prayed through her lonely years, certain that heaven had preserved her for this moment, that her body was meant to redeem the wound her father had inflicted by tearing England from Rome. When she walked into Winchester Cathedral on her wedding day, she saw not only banners and courtiers but signs of divine approval. Incense curled into the air like a promise. Yet behind the splendor was unease. Philip was handsome and dutiful, but his affection was cool, his gaze fixed on his wider empire. He treated her with respect, yet his heart seemed elsewhere. Mary told herself that if she bore him a child, love would follow, and with it the permanence of England's return to the old faith. Her counsel pressed her gently but firmly. The people murmured prayers for her fertility. Even in the streets of London, mothers whispered her name as if her womb carried their hopes as much as her own. Mary felt it in every glance, every bow, every sermon. Her body was not private. It was the battlefield of her reign. In the silence of her chamber, she thought of her mother Catherine. She remembered the prayers whispered through tears, the unshaken faith that even Henry could not strip away. Catherine had died abandoned, but she had died loyal to her God. Mary vowed that her own reign would restore that dignity. To her, faith was not a comfort for the weak. It was the foundation of her life. Without it, she was only a woman scarred by rejection. With it, she was chosen, destined to deliver England back to salvation. Night after night, she pressed her hands together until her knuckles whitened, whispering that God would not abandon her. She believed that every humiliation she had endured was preparation, that her suffering was not meaningless, but a path toward redemption. And so she placed her hope, her marriage, and her crown on a single fragile promise, that she would bear the child who would save both her soul and her kingdom. The winter of 1554 carried a fever of hope. The court announced that Queen Mary was with child. From cathedrals to marketplaces, the news spread like fire on dry straw. Bells tolled across London. Bonfires lit the sky, and people knelt in thanksgiving. For the first time in years, England saw its future secured in a Catholic heir. Within the palace, preparations bordered on ritual. A cradle of carved oak was lined with velvet and gold. Priests rehearsed baptismal rites. Courtiers whispered of honors to come, and ambassadors wrote home of the triumph God had granted. Mary felt the weight of every gaze. Her body swelled. Her gowns were loosened. Her attendants whispered that the signs were undeniable. To her, it was the fulfillment of a covenant written long before her reign. At night, in the glow of candlelight, she pressed her hand to her stomach and told Jane Dormer, her young lady-in-waiting, "This child will heal England's wounds." Jane remembered those words all her life. But time moved differently within the Queen's chambers. What began as certainty grew into waiting, and waiting turned into silence. The expected stirrings of life within her never came. She prayed harder, convincing herself that heaven required patience, yet the stillness lingered, heavier than stone. Dr. Thomas Wendy was summoned again and again, learned and cautious. He examined her in quiet tones. At last, when her attendants had withdrawn, Mary asked him plainly, "If not a child, then what grows in me?" His answer was hesitant. "Majesty, nature deceives even the most faithful. It may be water collecting in the womb. It may be a hidden growth. Some call it dropsy. Yet all signs have mirrored a true pregnancy." Mary turned away, clutching her rosary. Then let it be God's secret. By the spring of 1555, she withdrew into confinement, the seclusion before childbirth. Her chambers were darkened, tapestries drawn across the windows, her world reduced to silence, prayer, and the measured steps of her women. Outside, the court waited for the cry of a prince. Inside, she waited for a pain that never came. Weeks slipped into months. No labor began. No infant emerged. The palace grew tense, servants whispering outside the chamber doors, courtiers pacing the corridors. In London, the people began to murmur. Some claimed she had miscarried. Others spoke more cruelly, that she had carried only air. When Dr. Wendy returned with his final verdict, there was no softening of the truth. No child would come. Mary listened in silence, her face pale as marble. Jane Dormer, standing nearby, saw her clasp the rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. Only one sentence escaped her lips. "My body has betrayed me." When she emerged from confinement, the cradle stood empty. The golden frame, once polished for celebration, now seemed like a coffin never filled. The promise of new life had dissolved into silence. To the people, she became an object of ridicule. To Mary herself, the loss was unspeakable. Yet her faith clung to the belief that this was not the end, only a trial. And in that conviction, a darker resolve began to take root. When the palace announced a second pregnancy in 1557, the news fell upon England like a tide breaking against the shore. For many, it felt as if the first disappointment had been a cruel trick that God now sought to correct. Bells rang again. Sermons thundered of providence restored, and the golden cradle was uncovered from its shroud of dust. Mary clung to the swelling of her body as proof that heaven had not abandoned her. She remembered the humiliation of the empty confinement 2 years before, but she forced herself to believe that this time would be different. To Jane Dormer she whispered only once, her voice steadier than her heart, "This is no illusion. God has given me another chance." Around her, the courtiers rehearsed joy, but the echoes of the first failure lingered. The air was heavier, the smiles more forced, the prayers tinged with unease. Dr. Thomas Wendy examined her with professional restraint, his hands gentle, his words cautious. He did not speak of certainty. Instead, he offered patience. His silence, more than his speech, told Mary all she feared. In the background of her hope stood Philip. Mary remembered how, during her first confinement, he had briefly shared in the court's anticipation. He had appeared at her side, offered her hand a ceremonial kiss, and spoken of the child as if it might secure his bond with England. But when the months passed and no infant came, he had withdrawn swiftly, returning to Spain and to the vast empire that mattered more than one fragile queen. Now, as rumors of a second pregnancy spread, Philip's response was colder still. He did not linger in her chambers or speak of a future son. He remained polite, distant, bound by obligation rather than devotion. For Mary, his silence was sharper than any word. She reached for him only once, resting her hand upon his arm. "When our son is born, you will not leave me," she said quietly. Philip inclined his head, but his eyes looked past her, already elsewhere. The loneliness pressed upon her as heavily as the tapestries that darkened her chambers. Jane observed her kneeling longer at her prayers, clutching her rosary until her fingers trembled. The Queen's faith had always been her armor, yet now it seemed to harden into something more desperate. Each day without movement in her womb drove her deeper into prayer, as if she could force heaven's hand by sheer endurance. Outside, England waited with a mixture of hope and dread. The people prayed for a prince, but whispers returned, muttering that perhaps the Queen's body was deceiving her again. Foreign ambassadors reported uneasily, noting the absence of quickening, yet none dared confront her. Inside the palace, Mary's world narrowed to silence, Philip's indifference, Dr. Wendy's caution. Jane's worried eyes all circled her like shadows. She was left with only her conviction that God must make good on his promise, that he would not let her be mocked twice. But as summer deepened, the silence of her womb remained unbroken. The cradle gleamed in its chamber, untouched, a reminder that faith and despair could wear the same face. By the autumn of 1557, the palace could no longer ignore the silence. The months of waiting had turned from anticipation into dread. Mary, still heavy in figure, had withdrawn into her rooms, her prayers more strained with each passing day. At last, she summoned Dr. Thomas Wendy. The chamber was lit only by the trembling glow of candles, their shadows crawling across the tapestries. Jane Dormer stood in the corner, silent, her young face pale. The Queen fixed her physician with a gaze sharpened by exhaustion. "Doctor," Wendy bowed and spoke with the bluntness of a man who could no longer conceal the truth. "Majesty, there is no sign of life, no pulse, no quickening, no labor. What seemed certain has proven false." The words cut through the chamber like a blade. No cautious phrases, no hopeful delay. Only a verdict. For Mary, it was as though the floor beneath her had shifted. She sat rigid, her rosary pressed so tightly in her hand that the beads left marks upon her skin. Jane, watching, later recalled how the Queen whispered to herself, barely audible. Then all this time, it was nothing. Modern medicine would give the name pseudocyesis to what she endured, a phantom pregnancy, in which the mind's desperation molds the body into imitation. The swelling of the abdomen, the cessation of menses, even the sensations of movement signs that deceive not only the woman, but those around her. In Mary's case, the weight of dynastic expectation, her deep faith, and her yearning for redemption made her body echo her hope. Other explanations have been offered. A buildup of fluid within her abdomen, or a hidden growth in the womb. Yet for 16th century medicine, the mystery was impenetrable. For the Queen, the explanation did not matter. What mattered was the betrayal. Twice her body had carried the signs of life, and twice it had delivered only emptiness. She had believed she was chosen to redeem her mother's suffering, to secure her father's crown, to restore England to the faith of Rome. Now she saw only humiliation. Philip's reaction deepened the wound. When told of the physician's judgment, he offered no words of comfort, no promise of loyalty. He spent his days in councils and correspondence, his eyes fixed on wars abroad, where Mary had seen in her body the future of England. Philip saw only failure. The golden cradle, polished once again, was covered in cloth and pushed to the side like a relic of mockery. Mary sat before it in silence. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting her shadow across the empty room. "I was never a mother," she said at last, her voice cold and steady. "Only a vessel for God's punishment." From that moment, her grief hardened into resolve. If no child would come to cleanse the kingdom, then another sacrifice must. The verdict of her physician was not simply the end of hope. It was the turning point where despair became the seed of fire. The verdict of her physician had left Mary hollow. Yet from that emptiness, a new conviction began to take form. If her womb was barren, it was not because God had abandoned her, but because England itself had not been cleansed. Twice she had prepared for life, and twice heaven had delivered silence. To her mind, the message was unmistakable. God demanded fire. In the months that followed, the palace changed its rituals. The cradle was covered in cloth. The nursery door closed. In its place, orders were drafted for the punishment of heretics. Proclamations declared that those who clung to false faith would be given no mercy. For Mary, the bodies of Protestants would become the offering she could not give through childbirth. The fires began in Smithfield. Wooden stakes were driven into the earth, and kindling piled high beneath trembling prisoners. Londoners gathered in uneasy crowds, the air thick with smoke and fear. Mary did not watch in person, but she prayed in her chapel as the flames consumed flesh. "Let their ashes cleanse my womb," she whispered, "and England's soul with it." Reports spread quickly. Bishops, ministers, and simple men and women burned in marketplaces across the realm. The number climbed into the hundreds. Some in the court recoiled, yet Mary pressed forward. To her, every execution was not cruelty, but sacrifice, a ritual to wash away the sin that had cursed her body. Jane Dormer, ever near her, saw how the queen knelt for hours after each burning, her hands clasped until blood welled from her knuckles. "If I cannot give birth to a son," Mary told her once, "then I will give birth to a faithful kingdom." The words chilled Jane more than the screams outside the palace walls. Philip remained distant, his attention on Spain and the wars abroad. He offered no protest to the burnings, but neither did he share in Mary's fervor. His indifference cut her more deeply than open opposition would have. She ruled alone, clinging to the flames as the only proof that her reign still carried divine purpose. The people whispered another name now. No longer Mary, the hopeful mother, but Mary, the burner of souls, Bloody Mary. To her enemies it was condemnation, but to Mary it was almost confirmation. She believed heaven had chosen her not for the tenderness of a mother, but for the severity of a judge. The smoke that rose over England was both her weapon and her prayer. Each pyre was a substitute for the child that never came. Each pile of ash a reminder that her body's silence had been transformed into fire. In the end, she had found a way to answer God's command, even if it left her remembered not for life, but for death. The verdict of 2 phantom pregnancies had left scars deeper than humiliation. Mary's body, once swollen with the illusion of life, did not return to health. The swelling of her belly persisted, hard and painful, a grotesque reminder of a child that never was. Her physicians whispered of fluid collecting in her womb, of growths they could not see, what they could not name then. Modern medicine calls cancer of the womb or ovaries, a disease that mimics pregnancy before it devours its host. By 1558, her body bore the marks of that hidden enemy. Her stomach distended grotesquely. Her legs swelled with fluid until walking was agony, and ulcers erupted upon her skin. The courtiers spoke in hushed voices of the odor that clung to her chamber, the scent of a body rotting while still alive. Jane Dormer, faithful to the end, described how Mary coughed blood into her linen, her breath thick with infection. At times she screamed from stabbing pains in her abdomen, clutching herself as if the phantom child had returned in the form of torment. "I carry death within me," she muttered once through clenched teeth, her eyes glazed with fever. The queen who had burned heretics now seemed to burn from within. Each day the disease consumed more of her flesh, leaving her weak, skeletal, and unrecognizable beneath her silks. The rosary she clutched was stained with sweat and blood, beads slipping through fingers too thin to hold them steady. Philip was gone, occupied with his empire. No husband's hand soothed her brow. No child stood at her side, alone in her chamber. Mary faced the slow unraveling of her body as if it were the final judgment. Physicians applied poultices, prayed over her, but nothing could stop the decay. The court avoided her rooms when they could, unwilling to inhale the stench of death that lingered in the tapestries. On November 17, 1558, after weeks of fever and delirium, Mary Tudor died at the age of 42. She left no heir, no son to vindicate her suffering. Her throne passed to Elizabeth, the Protestant sister she had sought to disinherit. The triumph she had prayed for vanished in smoke. History named her Bloody Mary, remembered for the flames that consumed hundreds. Yet the deeper tragedy lay in the cradle that was never filled. In one chamber of the palace it sat abandoned, covered in dust, while outside the scars of the pyres blackened the earth. Between the empty cradle and the charred stakes stretched the true legacy of Mary Tudor, a reign defined not by life, but by death, not by redemption, but by fire and decay. Was she cursed by heaven, or simply betrayed by her own failing flesh? That question lingers still, like the smoke that once rose over her kingdom. And so her story ends. But our journey into the darkest chambers of history continues. Join us and subscribe as we uncover more rulers whose crowns brought not glory, but ruin.